Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It is Sunday morning here in the upper Midwest in Minnesota. Kind of a cold, dreary, east side of London kind of day, which is okay on a Sunday morning. You get your coffee and you kind of bundle up a little bit. Got my Willis Reed, New York Knicks, early 70s championship squad. He was a great player. Down 15 pounds. So again, feeling good about going to the gym and getting some exercise. It's been a nice change for sure. So I'm going to go real quick update on the trading cards. And one of the cool features I want to show you here is that I can sort them by where these musicians are from, or I can sort them by instrument. And I just want to show you a couple things here real quick. I'm going to try to hold that as steady as possible. So what you're looking at there is trumpet players, and I'm sorting it. Obviously I got that feature out where I'm sorting it by the trumpet players: Hubbard, Armstrong, Clifford Brown, Chet Baker, Lee Morgan, Donald Byrd, Sweets Edison, Dizzy Gillespie, and let's just keep going down here. Thad Jones, Roy Eldridge, Kenny Dorham, Howard McGee, Fats Navarro, Charlie Shavers, Clark Terry, Jack Sheldon, Stu Williamson, Red Rodney, Nat Adderley, Dave Burns, but Ruby Braff, Booker Little, Idris Suleiman, Blue Mitchell, Ernie Wilkins, Joe Wilder, Dupree Bolton, Wilbur Hardin, Shorty Rogers, Conte Condoli, Art Farmer, Miles Davis, Benny Carter, Dave Burns, Joe Newman, Dizzy Reese, Freddie Kephard, Woody Shaw, Bill Hardman, Don Cherry, Hot Lips Page, Vic Spiderbeck, King Oliver, Ernie Royal, Don Elliott, and Carmel Jones. And that represents about 2/3 of the trumpet players. Just for fun, let's show you another field. So let's say look at the guitar players. So there we go. There's Kenny Burrell, Wes Montgomery, Grant Green, Johnny Smith, Barney Kessel, Tal Farlow, Jimmy Raney, Freddie Green, Django Reinhardt, Joe Puma, Charlie Christian, Chuck Wayne, Billy Bean, Tiny Grimes, Al Casey, Oscar Moore, Toots Steelman, Sal Salvador, Herb Ellis, Darnell Schwartz, Howard Roberts, Billy Bauer, Barry Galbraith, Jim Hall, and Al Caiola. And again, what you have there is about 2/3 of what the eventual sequence will have. And then coolly, I can also sort things by city. So now, I spelled that wrong. So now we're still spelled wrong. Detroit. There we go. So now we're looking at Detroit musicians. You got Milt Jackson, Kenny Burrell, Curtis Fuller, Yusef Lateef, Paul Chambers, Hank Jones, Pepper Adams, Gene Harris, Donald Byrd, Lucky Thompson, Dorothy Ashby, Thad Jones, Tommy Flanagan, Howard McGee, Doug Watkins, Terry Pollard, Ron Carter, Julius Watkins, J.C. Hurd, Alice Coltrane, Teddy Edwards, Elvin Jones, Frank Rosalino, Charles McPherson, Louis Hayes, and Sonny Red. And so whether you're sorting it by instrument or by geography, there's interesting stuff to be learned and gleaned. So I'm kind of really enjoying this process. Take a look at tenor sax players. How about that? Tenor. There's the tenor players all in the red. So again, there's probably 65, 70 tenor players in here now. It's, it's a real great learning tool to set of cards. You could type in alto, you could type in baritone. There's even a couple tuba players, drummers. So I'm pretty excited about now seeing this many cards done and finished. And the back sides are done as well for all these ones. Almost up to 400. There's 373 right there. So I almost got 400 done. The set's going to be almost 700 when it's complete. But it's really cool seeing them searched by field like this. The piano players there's a lot of them. Here's the piano players, and it's a pretty endless stream of piano players. Amazing how many of them are from New York. So it's a fun little set of cards I've made, and they're super informative and educational. That's what I'm excited about, is just how much I can use these for episodes and as a learning tool for myself. and hopefully for others. So next I want to talk to you about a record I listened to yesterday that I absolutely just love. And it's a classic example of what I call cool bop. And that's by the great Stu Williamson, who I talk about him and his brother Claude quite a lot, along with Charlie Mariano and Frank Rosolino. All of that great West Coast talent that was part of Herman and Stan Kenton's groups made records as leaders on the West Coast in the 50s. And they were young, kind of fiery musicians, not trying to be just kept by the limitations of the big band settings, even though those big bands were fairly progressive and fairly hard swinging for the time, actually, both Woody Herman and Stan Kenton. Although Kenton's stuff can be a lot more canned and processed depending on what era, what group. But still, when you saw them live, they were quite the phenomenon. But Williamson's a fiery player out of Vermont, along with his brother Claude. They made their way to the West Coast and played in some of those bigger group settings. But they made some records, especially these ones for Bethlehem here, that are just killer fire. And if you look at the album cover, it's got that pixelated kind of newsprinty dot matrix, whatever it's called. And it's a great burnt gold black cover that's just modern and still stands the test of time. That's an influence on Reed Miles at Blue Note to come. This is probably 1955, maybe early 56. And that color blocking, it's just, what's what I'm looking for? It predates, it's prescient of what's coming from graphic design at Blue Note by Reed Miles and other labels as well. But Burt Goldblatt, I did an episode on him a year and a half ago. He's an important part of graphic design and jazz. And graphic design and jazz was the leader in the field in this period. Just great stuff. But it kind of captures the modernity of the music inside. Again, you have Stu Williamson on the trumpet. He's a leader with the great Charlie Mariano out of Boston. Claude Williamson, his brothers on the piano. Max Bennett's on the bass. And Max is one of the great bass players of this era, along with the great Stan Levy on the drums. So you have 5 really hard swinging cats that are kind of overlooked by today's repressing culture and the reissuing programs. They're not going to think about, oh, we need to put out Stu Williamson. You know, I bet Fresh Sounds out of Spain might have touched this. The Japanese might have done this one. But boy, this is great stuff. And it's never going to come to you through the Tone Poet and the average YouTuber's channel talking about all the modern reissues, because this stuff's deeper off the hidden path. And yet it's fantastic. It's hard driving. It's got a lot of the tempos and the textures of the hard bop that's happening on the East Coast and the black community. This is cool bop. You know what I mean? It's just as up tempo. It's just as hard driving. It's just as much about the musicianship and the ability to play melodically within shape and rhythm and groove at high tempos. It just doesn't have the same emotional context. And that's because you can't fake who you are, your identity, especially not when it comes to something like jazz, which is such an honest interaction between you and your horn. Words can be very dishonest, as I've said many times. You can be a white rapper, let's say, and make up an entire history and rap about all the things you claim to have seen and been and done. And who knows? Is it true? A jazz musician puts their horn to their mouth, and that link to their soul just expresses what they feel. So there can still be a lot of angst and tension and pain and sorrow and depression and addiction. All those same things can afflict, the white jazz musician. So they can still have a lot of things to say. Joy could be one of the things you have to say. And it leads again to my old philosophy of the 3 brush strokes of how to hear and understand where a musician's coming from. Their personality is the most important in terms of understanding how they handle their life's experiences within their environment. So those are those 3 brush strokes. What's their environment? What are they born into? What's the condition of their people and the community they live in, and the prosperity and the job opportunities, and all those things factor your environment. And your experience is kind of how you lived within that environment in terms of your parents and addiction and your wife and your children and your jobs and your education. That's all part of your environment within your experience within the environment. And then your personality dictates how you handle those experiences. no two people handle the same affliction the same way. And so, listen to the tempo here. Max Bennett's just rolling. So it's really important, I think, to have a grasp of where an artist is coming from, not just musician, any form of art. If you don't have any historical context, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, it loses a lot of its meaning. This isn't some Hallmark card meant to be a greeting you put on the wall that's kind of fine and dandy and neat, but has no deeper meaning. It was it was the voice of an oppressed people in the wilderness, in desperation and occupation and slavery, saying, you know what, in spite of this, someday we're going to find the land of milk and honey, the promised land, and come through on the other side and find a heaven and a paradise on this earth. That hope and that optimism needs to come from someplace. And it's amazing how art can express with honesty and integrity the real experience behind what a musician or an artist has to say. And that's so valuable. Without that context, I think we're very lost and disconnected. But once you have that historical context, suddenly what an artist has to say or where they're coming from becomes crystal clear. And again, I want to do something, I did this once before, but I want each and every one of you to think for a second of your own life. And now let's say you spent that life, instead of the one you've lived in an oppression, a time of tyranny, of global conflict, and that's not to say we don't have some of those issues today, but if you're a Ukrainian, you can validate how quickly that sense of security can leave you and how quickly that'll change your values and what you find to be important on a daily basis. But I just think it's important to recognize and once in a while put yourself in the musician's shoes. And people sometimes question, like, are these musicians really talking about this stuff? Is that part of the context of where they're coming from? And then I say to them, if you were arrested tomorrow and incarcerated for the next 15 years with no end in sight, and you were given a way to express your art through writing, through drawing, painting, through music, and if you knew you were there unjustly in this incarceration, and we're doing this on a very small scale, you're sentenced to 15 years. Okay? And that's your future at this point. But you know you shouldn't be there. You know you didn't do what you were accused of doing. You're innocent in this instant. And by no means is anybody completely innocent all the time. But it's that injustice that informs us about who a person is and where they're coming from. And if this was you, and you'd watched your family, say, tortured or taken from you, ripped apart, sent across different places, if you had seen your brother lynched, if you had seen your communities force-fed drugs on top of your own sorrow and your own incarceration for 15 years, and you were given a pen to write or some crayons to draw or a guitar to make music, let me ask you, when you express into that vehicle, that instrument, how could you not on some level be talking about the sorrow that's overcome you? And even if it was just a means to help you survive that pain and sorrow, there's still no way you can't somehow be talking about that experience and not using it as some way to help you overcome that struggle. And so a jazz musician, especially a black jazz musician, he can't on some level separate himself from his experience and his environment. No matter how hard he tries, no matter how much Charlie Mingus doesn't want to be seen as a black man in America, he still was. And Jay-Z said last year on 444, or not last year, about 5 years ago now, that no matter how much money he's got, he's still seen that way by most of America. He's still a black man. And to a lot of America, he's not that. He's something else. And the art helps them express that feeling, that condition, and helps them make a peace with it of sorts, which is what you would do as well in their shoes. You would be expressing, and again, as white people, we still have lots of pain. We still have lots of sorrow. We still have lots of grieving, lost loved ones, children that go astray, parents that are hard on us. There's plenty of things for us to feel sorrow about and express into our horns. It just becomes a bit more of an individual getting to know someone's history when you're talking about a white player like a Claude Williamson or a Stu Williamson, and knowing, okay, these guys came from Vermont, they were fairly well-to-do, they moved to the West Coast, and they just wanted to swing hard. They got this black music and they wanted to be a part of it. So they're swinging with a hard integrity. That's why it's that cool Bob. But their life's not filled and laced with these horror stories. So it's informing how I feel, where they're playing from. And so virtuosity and bravado and ego, it becomes part of the expression, plus their own personal experiences and sorrows and addictions and whatever else their life threw at them. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that if you were in somebody's shoes who had been oppressed for part of a lifetime, half a lifetime, let alone centuries, how could you possibly make art that wouldn't be expressing on some level your relationship with that sorrow? See what I'm saying? And so it's pretty hard to listen to black jazz musicians knowing the history, knowing the experiences, knowing the sorrow, the injustice, the inequality, the lack of opportunity. It's really hard to listen to that history and not feel it being expressed and being themselves being relieved of a lot of that burden through that playing. And for me, that's part of the issue with Miles. He came from enough of an affluent background, and his experiences were enough where the black community kind of, I want to say rejected him, but if you're an affluent black man, you don't share the same experiences as the poor blacks. And there's a rift, there's a divide, there's a disconnect. And then the white community can only embrace you so much because you're still a black man and a dark black at that. And it's something I didn't really realize until the last probably 5-10 years, is the shade of black mattered a lot. If you were light, Creole, mixed, you're still black, but you get away with a lot more in society than when you're black, like a Sudanese from the South Sudan. You know what I mean? Or some of the Somali, Eastern Africans, they're a black. And those people have a much tougher time and felt even more prejudice, which is a really sad thing. You know, it certainly isn't how things are meant to be by any means. But I just think it's important that we never forget. And I think sometimes in order to do that, we have to put ourselves into that place, into those shoes, and say, you know what? If my life had been nothing but... And here it is in white, the white history of the English coming through the Second World War, watching their cities bombed to the ground, and a lot of people lost their parents. And then think about guys like Roger Waters from Pink Floyd and John Lennon from the Beatles, and the kind of consciousness and awareness and empathy and experience and sorrow and fear, anger and hate. Those guys expressed a lot of political commentary in their music that was in part driven by their experience as young men living through one of the greatest, most destructive periods in human history. So by no means is this a black thing. It's the life and circumstances of me, myself, plus me and my people. And then if you're broad enough in your thinking, we can get to a place where all humans are part of my group. And I think that's where empathy comes in, through knowledge and understanding. We recognize that my group is a big group. Human earthling is who I am. And that's one of the other metaphors I often used to tell my children is take all the labels that are placed on you at birth and process them and discard them. And recognize that what's on this can, I'm ripping the label off. I'm getting out some masking tape. I'm going to write down the only ingredients that I'm sure of on the can, So I'm labeled correctly for society to see who I am. And human earthling is the only two ingredients I'm positive of. Race, religion, nationality, sexuality, those things are all temporal. They don't have staying power in terms of defining who I am. The migration of my people, my ancestors, all predates and has a much further, deeper history than the history of the nations of the world today. The religions of the world are all kind of 2,000-3,000 years old. And yet there's a human migration, I'm a part of that, goes much further than that. We got brothers in ancient Australia 40,000 years ago painting caves, looking at the stars and going, I wonder, how am I connected to all of this? And so if your empathy and understanding becomes broad enough, we can start to be empathetic for all human brethren. And that's really where we should be in our global age of global traffic and satellite photos and pictures from space. We're a vulnerable little blue orb hurtling through the black vacuum of darkness. And we're so discombobulated with each other and live in such a shambled state of comprehension of my fellow human brethren that we really all should be ashamed of ourselves. You know, we should have a much different, this black jazz race experience should be an ancient history story, not something that happened last century, 20 minutes ago. Civil rights shouldn't have happened in your grandparents' generation or your parents' generation. It should have happened back around Nero and Julius Caesar. That's how history should have, slavery shouldn't have been abolished 150 years ago. It should have been abolished 1,000 years ago. So we're still coming out of the dark ages in a lot of ways. And a lot of our political correctness today, it's very much lip service. It's not really addressing the issues. It's just sweeping things under the carpet, saying let's not talk about that. Because ignoring issues doesn't make them go away. Discussing them and confronting them is how you do it. And so shutting everybody up and saying you can't say none of the bad words makes everyone kind of live in isolation and no one's knowing their real thoughts. And it's only really in conflict and argument that growth can happen. And that's part of why I don't have such a great deal of patience for this modern movement. Again, there's plenty of oppressed people out there, but a lot of today what I feel is being pushed on people is this kind of fake, woke mentality that doesn't change people's understanding or lead to any kind of growth. It just makes the people who feel a certain way not speak out very loudly. And I don't know if that's really successful or not. So again, the bottom line here is what I'm trying to say. Put yourself in those shoes. Put yourself in the worst scenario that you can possibly imagine. And then allow yourself to imagine if you made art, could you not be speaking about that condition, that experience, that environment? How could you pour your soul into your horn and say the things you want to say? And not on some level be talking about this injustice, man. Me and my people didn't deserve this. We didn't ask for this. Where's that land of milk and honey? Where's justice for me and my people? And you don't have to even be thinking it for your soul to be speaking that. Because it's a part of your community. It's a part of your belief and your faith and your structure. Just like the ancient Israelites spoke of freedom and codified some of what it meant. Because it's a man that's not free that can tell you what freedom means. In luxury and comfort, we can't really define freedom. It's not the things that we think it is. It's not about waving flags and national independence, and a lot of that's very illusionary and full of deceit. The constructs of freedom are only understood from someone who has lived their life not free, and they can help you decide what it means. And so this jazz music, it's coming from a place where you're speaking via improvisation your emotional condition. So if I'm improvising via my emotion, I mean, today I might just be furious at the woman I slept with last night. That might be where I'm coming from today. And tomorrow I might be like, oh man, I'm hungover. I shouldn't have had that last bottle of whiskey. But there's some days you get up there and deep from within your soul, you're also speaking about a greater oppression, a greater tyranny. And if it informs your playing in that sense, it's up to us as a listener to find the context of history and to apply their environment and their experience within that environment, and then to add that detail of their personality, and then suddenly have the ability to hear what a guy is saying. So a guy like Stu Williamson, he's speaking with a great deal of fire, a great deal of expression and virtuosity, and there's even some aggression in his playing. And it's powerful. He's a wonderful player. I absolutely love that record. I love Charlie Mariano. I love Bethlehem. But it can never really say to me some of the things that a guy like Eddie Lockjaw Davis could say to me, because Lockjaw Davis's experience was so different as a black man in the middle of the 20th century versus a white guy coming from Vermont. It doesn't diminish the value of it. It actually helps you understand his art better. See what I'm saying? And it's an important thing I need to kind of reiterate every once in a while on this channel, is when you're listening to music, if you're not feeling what the musician's trying to say, again, that's part of my thing with the audiophile thing. If you just listen to how good your speakers sound, and you're not even thinking about how great that drum pattern was and how sick that bass player's articulating that groove and that chunk of the piano while he's doing that kind of aggressive tact, if you're not feeling where these individual players are coming from and expressing, you're not opening your heart to those kind of expressions, you're missing a lot of what the art has to tell you. And again, so that's part of where that whole dialogue has come from in the last few episodes, talking about the music. If you post a record of some new record you bought, whether it's a cheap Doxy or Wax Time, or it's $1,000 original pressing, if part of you on some level is not talking about, man, did you hear the sax player on track 3? He's getting it into. He's got something on his mind that day. I don't know him very well, but man, he felt some fury. And if that doesn't make your mind question, what's he furious about? But if you're just listening to speakers, you're missing that whole context. And then you have a painting on your wall where you love the canvas, you like the frame, you like the instruments and the inks and the paints that they used, but you don't really understand what the painting's about. It doesn't have meaning. And the meaning is the value. We want to think that monetary value is what preempts everything. But if you don't understand the meaning of the art that you're enjoying or hanging on to or putting on your wall or reading, I think the artist would be disappointed. And I think there's a lot of jazz greats that if they could look through a wormhole into the world today and see how they're being remembered and how they're being spoken about, and people are paying $2,000 for my record, but they're not even talking about my playing or where I was coming from, or I think a lot of them would be very disappointed in the dialogue and the lack of understanding that we spend days talking about without ever once trying to get into the root of what a guy like Hank Mobley was saying, what Jackie McLean was saying, what Lee Morgan was saying, what Stu Williamson was saying. And even a guy like Stu Williamson, who was playing here with all white cats on the West Coast, those guys intermingled enough with the black musicians that oftentimes they can even be speaking for them. But again, they were two very different worlds, especially in this day. You know, Jackie McLean has just crossed the color barrier. There's been some integration by guys like Benny Goodman as early as the late 30s. Armstrong always played with Jack Teagard, and against a lot of people's popular opinion, there was mingling of the race. But when it came to recording records, not much. When it came to paydays, the scales were different. And that's a large part because certain labels just made a lot greater revenue than other labels. And if you're Blue Note and you're selling 5,000 copies of a Jimmy Smith record and 3,000 copies of a Babyface Willette record and 4,300 copies of a Hank Mobley record, you can only pay those guys so much. But if you're Jerry Mulligan and Chet Baker and Dave Brubeck on Fantasy and Pacific and Contemporary on the West Coast, primarily white labels, you're selling 20, 30,000 copies because all the white college kids are buying those records, and that's why they're so much easier to come by. It only makes sense that those labels are paying you more. And so if you're a white musician, sometimes it might be hard to say, I'm going to go work with these black guys, because you're not going to get paid the same. Blue Note can only pay you so much, and that's part of the reason why Blue Note doesn't record a lot of white artists, I'm sure. They just weren't paying enough. I mean, again, from 1532 in the Blue Note canon, the next 300 some records, there's not one led by a white musician. Not one. You have guys like Pepper Adams showing up as a sideman a lot, who was raised in the neighborhoods in Detroit. So he was pretty enwrapped in the black community and was seen almost like a brother by a lot of them from what I've read. And so he must have been okay with playing with his brothers and getting paid like the brothers. But if you're Chet Baker, I might really like these black guys here. They can play, but I'm getting paid $10,000 to make this record, not $1,200. And those are just numbers I'm throwing out there. But just the labels themselves and the distribution and the volumes of what they sold and how available they are today, it's telling us stuff about these men and what they made and how much money there was available to them. And so that was part of why the integration was so slow in happening. These guys probably had plenty of great black musician friends. There's a lot of great black talent on the West Coast. But when it came to getting paid, I got to take care of me and my family. And so there were 5 white guys on that record throwing down. And they're probably even playing with a degree of empathy because they know enough black guys where they feel, I wouldn't say guilt, but a certain sense of empathy and a brotherhood with them and are speaking for them at times. Certain white cats, I think, are far more ambassadors for the black community than other white players. Some white guys you really feel like were part and had a kinship and wanted to defend and justify and help promote the black musicians. But the black musicians never had, again, that's one of the things that's really slanted about today's perspectives. We see all these black icons of the music, and we really forget how obscure most of them were at the time. Even Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane in 1957, they weren't going to make the Playboy's Tenor Sax Greatest Players polls. You know what I mean? Miles Davis starts to get onto those lists, and you get a sprinkling of black guys here and there when they had a moment that was spectacular. Believe it or not, I got like Buddy Collette, I think, often makes those lists because he had fame in Los Angeles with the West Coast labels. But a lot of the great black talent we think of today, the Lee Morgans, the Hank Mobleys, Lou Donaldsons, Donald Byrds, Jackie McLean's. I mean, you go down that list. These guys weren't the top-selling artists by any stretch of the imagination in those days. They were fairly under the surface in terms of the national landscape. A lot of them never even got close to the big labels, let alone the middle-sized white labels. Verve was probably your best place to get distributed if you were a Sonny Stitt or a Roy Eldridge. But even that was somewhat regional. So again, there's a big difference. And so if we look through that lens today, we see how a lot of those artists that were legendary and important, but unknown and kind of obscure, we've elevated some of those guys into a higher place today. And so we think that when you go back to 1956, Thelonious Monk's going to be a huge name. But he really wasn't. He's just starting to get recognized by the critics and the players. And so it's white musicians like these guys who probably knew the black musicians better than any of white America, because the community was small enough that you knew when Clifford Brown came along and changed the trumpet. You knew when Jimmy Smith came along and changed the organ. So these white musicians knew the black innovators and black players and black stylists. And a lot of the white cats were equally innovative in their own but different ways. A guy like Jerry Mulligan, Jimmy Joffrey, very innovative players. But again, there's such a wide gulf between the opportunities that existed for a white jazz musician and the money that they made versus what the average black jazz musician was able to make. And it's part of what kept the lineups separate. And it's really not until the 60s where we started to see more integration of lineups and race and becoming less of a factor. And as the 60s progress and civil rights happens, a lot of this context starts to slip away. And part of that is that rhythm and blues, R&B, has now been given a license to say things into a microphone that you could only speak in code into a saxophone or a trumpet before. And so it takes some of that voice, some of that message away from what jazz was about. Jazz was this codified message of an oppressed people finding freedom and breaking chains. And even if you didn't understand it, you could kind of feel that power. A lot of people were attracted to it because there was a magnetic quality to it that was just powerful, but few understood all the time what was really happening. It's hard to understand the present in the present, you know. So these white cats are great parts of the story, and these guys can really, really play. And I'm guessing that for the most part, Mariano, Williamson's, Max, and Stan played with Dizzy and Parker, for Christ's sake. You know, so there is examples of these guys crossing over. And on a one-to-one level, most people don't have that same degree of fear and animosity. It's the fear of the unknown, which again is largely the white ruling class's fear. Most Black Americans have always had white friends, white coworkers. They've never had a complete freedom or absence of the other race in their life. So they're not scared necessarily because they have that interaction. And urban white Americans have always had interaction with racial diversity. So the urban white Americans usually aren't that scared of race and color either. It's really that rural community that lives in isolation and doesn't interact with the other races, other cultures, other people, that the fear of ignorance can be powerful enough to let the divide remain. But jazz was addressing all this American history in such a concise little nutshell, such a cool way to understand American history in the context of what was happening, and how these players are pouring emotion and experience and a personality. And if you want to understand personality, as I've said before, all you got to do is Google a guy's face, find 4 or 5 images of a guy's face, and you'll kind of get a gist of who this guy is personality-wise. I could show you 5 or 6 pictures of my children, and you know different things about each of them just based off their facial expressions and how they interact with the world. So I think it's an important thing to grasp, is how to hear and how to feel this music. And I think the best way to do it is to put yourself in those shoes and say, if I was in a place of great sorrow, and even in your life today, I'm sure you have some sorrow. It's hard to make art and not have it express your condition, to have it not be a part of venting your experiences, healing your pain and sorrow. And if that's how you would express and that's what you would say, how much more so than must these people who lived in oppression for centuries, every time they put the horn to their mouth, how could not part of their message be freedom for my people? Let my people go, we want the promised land. And there's a reason why they clung on to church so strongly. You need faith and belief in something when you don't have a light at the end of the tunnel. It's easier for the middle class, the bourgeoisie, to move away from religion because they don't need it the same way. For the bourgeoisie, religion starts to become something that deals with only really mortality, because most of the other things, I'm living in a gilded palace, so I don't really need faith in God and religion that much. Just the uncertainty of the afterlife, where I'm like, okay, give me a book, give me a Bible, something, as that becomes more a part of your horizon. But if you live in constant hand-to-mouth experience and starvation and disease and food and alcoholism, drugs, all these are part of your daily life, you best believe your art's going to be expressing that. So try to put yourself in those musicians' shoes at times and try to grasp, if I was living in this guy's experience, would my expression not be about that experience at least part of the time? And of course it would be. Of course it would be. And I think that's an important way to grasp and be able to understand and hear and feel jazz. These people are all expressing their life's experiences. And it's the same for white rock and roll players, black blues players, black rhythm and blues players. We're always talking about our lives, our experiences, our wants, our needs, our hopes, our fantasies, our dreams. But it's the most oppressed people in society that end up making the most poignant art because they have the greatest mountain to climb as a people. And every rung in this ladder that climbs that hillside, jazz slowly etched another step, another stone, another rock, another footstep. And then rhythm and blues, Sam Cooke, Curtis Mayfield, The Impressions, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, those guys took that torch and continued that voice of freedom. And then guys like Chuck D and Rakim and KRS-One, Most Def, they continued common that voice of freedom. And where is it today? That's something that's hard for me to really get a grasp on. You know, America's become a really strange place. So I'm going to leave today's episode with that. Put yourself in the shoes. This is what I'm challenging you all to do. And ask yourself, if you had a life of nothing but sorrow and struggle, what would your art say? See what I'm saying? What would your art say? And it's, I think, the most important way for the music to speak to us, which is very different from sitting back and listening to a record and going, well, this one sounds different compared to my other pressing because of this needle and this amp. And, oh, I don't really like the mids on this. It's like, if that's what your focus is, boy, you're really missing a lot of the story. And that's, again, part of my personal experience with that community is rarely do I get that kind of insight from people whose focus is on those things. It seems like they're missing the entire book. You seem to love Tom Sawyer, but you don't really seem to talk much about the story. A lot of talk about the ink and the book binding and the leather and the paper, but what about that story? And when you're talking about jazz, you're talking about an American story. That's one of the greatest, most compelling narratives in human history. 400 years of oppression reduced down to a music of improvised emotion. Imagine any oppressed group in history having the power of jazz. Imagine Moses in Egypt taking Pharaoh's instruments and writing some songs going, F you motherfuckers, someday you're going to get yours. That's a joyous thing. That's a powerful yin-yang balance. We might not have freedom, but we've got this music that allows me to write through the annals of history and for it to ring out throughout time the injustice that was done to us as a warning, but also as an inspiration to all of us to remind ourselves that, you know, things might be bad today, they might be bad for the next week or month, but if I have my health, I'm blessed. If I got people who love me, I'm blessed. I got food in my stomach, I'm blessed. And when you look at a guy like Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington or Count Basie, and you see the forgiveness and the love and the willingness to put a hand out and shake it and to hug across the aisle and to try to heal and mend what pained us. Your love and respect for these men can only grow in volume. How I feel in my heart about Louis Armstrong is I feel like every state in this country should have a Louis Armstrong public school or library. He's an absolute icon of American history. Ellington's a linchpin of the American story. Basie is an absolute Mount Rushmore figure in terms of the joy that he put into the world to help us overcome sorrow. These are important figures historically, not just musically. Yet we live in kind of the shadows of it still, where it's too recent for us to realize what kind of civil rights leaders and fighters for justice these people were, and how a lot of what their message was reconciliation, harmony, peace, one accord, a better tomorrow. Because on some level they recognize that until there's a better tomorrow for everyone, there won't be a better tomorrow for my people. And being militant and up in arms is probably not the best thing for my children or my children's children. It's about us learning to get along. And that's why after the war, when a lot of these black musicians came back from serving and having been in Europe and being served in restaurants and being fed by waiters and not being forced to wait out back of the kitchen, by being treated like humans, being greeted by villagers, being seen as heroes and liberators, to come back to America and to go back to being less than. It's why that next group of generation came along as black young men and created that backlash and that Black Panther movement and that independence of the black community and the black Muslim movement for independence and freedom of thought and the black jazz movement of Hard Bop. It was a backlash against my descendants before me, ancestors, Basie, Armstrong, Louis. These guys were trying to extend an olive branch. We went and served in your wars. We were promised something when we came back, and all you gave us was heroin and freeways to cut our neighborhoods off from the rest of the city, and a new form of poverty, and a new form of uneducated, divisive neighborhoods, and preventing us from buying property and living in neighborhoods we want to live in. There was an exhaustion, a fed-up resistance, finally, that Hard Bop's expressing. But it's the history of all this stuff that's happening that makes what Lee Morgan has to say powerful. If you're just listening to Lee Morgan go, I like how his trumpet sounds on my speakers, you are missing 99% of what he had to say. Put it in the context of where America was, decade by decade by decade. And then look at what each decade of those generations of jazz musicians had to say. And it's synonymous and harmonious with everything I'm telling you. This is not just me speculating. And if you don't believe me, look at the words of what some of Stevie Wonder and Curtis Mayfield and Sam Cooke, a change is going to come. This comes on the heels of the jazz hard bop age. There's no way what Chuck D has to say lyrically in 1988 wasn't echoing what the soul singer said in 1972 and what the jazz members sang in 1956. Because that was the new post-war history for Black America. So that history is so integral in understanding what the music's about. And so a great record like this is on the periphery of that history, empathizing with the black musicians they know and are friends with, but still living a different life in America. But boy, these cats can play. It doesn't affect your ability to play. It only impacts what your soul is saying into that instrument. It can't be fake. You can't be Vanilla Ice talking about how hard you are. If you're a white trumpet player from Vermont, you can still play your butt off, but it's going to be saying something different. And it's up to us as the listeners and appreciators of the art to recognize the times that the art was made in so we can start to quantify what the artist was saying. And the best way to do it is put yourself in a place of oppression and ask yourself, what kind of art would I make if that was my life? If I watched my parents and my children and my brothers and sisters struggle, what would my pen write? What would my horn say? I know what my horn would say. I know what my pen would write. And when I was a young man, probably 10, 11, 12, 13, I got beat up almost every day in school because of my parents' evangelical religious beliefs, living in a very conservative Mennonite community. I got picked on and bullied and beat up, and There'd be 10 guys kicking me, holding me down, while girls would spit on me, and I went through some real difficult years. So I understand how it feels to be persecuted. But I also understand how much that shaped me and how that I did pick up a pen in those days and started writing song lyrics as a way to dream about a different way. And music's been my shelter ever since. It's a harbor. It's a relationship I have. Whether it's me playing stuff on the guitar, singing at a piano, playing, beating on a drum set, playing heavy metal, singing, rapping, all that stuff, I've done all of it. Because it's therapeutic at times. You just need to do it. But when you can apply that into listening to music, and then you find the historically oppressed group of people who make a century's worth of music, it's shame on us if we don't hear it, don't feel it, don't understand it. And so this kind of ties in with the last few episodes in terms of how we collect records and how we hear records and why the audiophile people, I think, are sometimes missing the music. There's a far more powerful message in the music than just the fidelity, quality of the record. And no matter how high the fidelity is of that pressing, if what that pressing is telling you is not making your hair stand on end on your arm, your speakers ain't going to do that. It's your mind being open to the message, to what they have to be talking about. There's no way this guy can be playing this furious, this aggressive, this tactile and percussive and staccato. He's grinding. He's searching. He's flailing. He's grasping. He's drowning. Why is he drowning? Read your history. Look at the prison populations. Look at the shorter lifespan for the black male in America, which for decades has been 7 years, 8 years shorter than a white male. That's injustice. That's what it looks like. We're going to live to be 78. You're going to live to be 69. If you're lucky. If you're lucky. And in that context, how can that art that they make not be saying something revolutionary? And if you open your ears and your mind to that perception, and I'm sure many of you have, if you've been watching the channel for any length of time, you've heard this before. But if that doesn't make your hair stand on end and make that music come to life in a different kind of way, bringing the Watts riots and Detroit riots and Newark riots and all the different oppression and the hosing down of the black men, and if that doesn't all make this music make some kind of sense now, when you listen to Hard Bop, there's a reason why I call this Cool Bop. Because in some ways it sounds very much the same as Hard Bop, but things are a little bit cooler in that village. And I'm guessing Stu and Claude are going to jump in the Jeep, head down to Malibu, and maybe catch a few waves after this session. It doesn't mean they didn't play with all kinds of fury, because they sure as heck do. But it's a different expression. That's all I got for you today. It's something I need to touch on once in a while. And I think, again, that personal expression, when you look at it from your own, if I was making art from a place of tyranny, would my art not somehow be standing up against that tyranny? And I think if you don't acknowledge that it would, you're lying. You absolutely would be speaking on it. Whether it was in a coded message or directly, you would be speaking on that injustice and how it makes you feel. And then when you take that cloak of oppressive weight of American history and apply it to the music, the tenacity and vivacious expression of joy and life that they managed to muster in spite of all of this, it's revelatory. It's exciting. It's a story of overcoming in spite of. And that has an inspiration that's so great that it should speak to all mankind. And it does. That's why jazz is powerful in Europe. That's why jazz connects in post-war Japan. It's joy in spite of... Ugh. That should be a t-shirt. Joy in spite of... Ugh. That's what music can do. That's what art can do. So I strive to everybody, try to personalize it. Try to make yourself in those shoes. And what would you say? And then put on a Lee Morgan record or a Jackie McLean record and let that process sink in. Because it's there. Y'all be safe. Y'all have a great day. If you want to support the channel, Patreon, there's a description below. You can go to the merchandise store and buy a t-shirt or a hoodie. That's always appreciated as well. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Hit that like button. We appreciate all the support we can get. And I'm also fine with it only remaining a clique kind of dedicated group of followers who gets it. We don't need to go viral. We don't need a bunch of people that are superficially hanging on to feel part of something. I'd rather this group remain a fantastic group of people from around the world that we dialogue and comment and share. And boy, you guys are awesome. Seriously, some of the comments I've been getting this last week or so on some of these episodes, it's just a great community that we've built. So cheers to you guys. Much love from the bottom of my heart. We in it to win it. Y'all be safe. Stay warm. Stay safe. Stay healthy. We'll talk to y'all soon. Probably back on Tuesday with an episode. Peace.